Hey guys, I'm Lex. There's no such thing as entertainment, and this is another theory video. Now, in this video in particular, I want to talk about this idea that I hear all the time talked about in film criticism, just in general. This idea that film is subjective and that there's nothing objective about the film itself, which is ironic given that people are critiquing the film, which is an object that you're watching. Anyways, the point I'm making is that there's this idea that any critique of a film is just someone's opinion and that there's no such thing as an objectively good or bad film. I'd like to disagree here. Hear me out. Now, I did a theory video before talking about show don't tell and how in particular that principle, when executed correctly, makes for a better film. See, what movies are is they're not just, moving images on a screen that people decide how they feel about them. What a movie is a collection of principles specifically related to the medium of film that are brought together to communicate a message. So the better in which those principles are executed, the better movie you have. That's it. That's all. Simple as that. And what makes that movie good or bad is how well it's communicating its themes, its messages, whatever the author is choosing to tell and, disseminate to people. And that, in essence, is what makes a good movie, which means there is such thing as a good movie. See, every film principle has a good way of executing it and a bad way of executing it. I'll go back to that show don't tell principle. Typically, when you're doing a movie, you want to show and not tell simply because of the fact that it's much better on the audience to see what you're talking about rather than say, oh, when I was younger, this happened to me, etc., etc. It just lands better. But at the same time, you can't show everything in the plot. There are things you actually have to choose what to show and what not to show, what to tell and what not to show. All those things are involved when someone is making a film. So it's actually a puzzle piece. But you see, as with all principles they're usually the principle or rule and then the exceptions to that rule. So show don't tell. There are instances where you would show and not tell. That's the rule itself. But there are also moments where it's actually better just to tell and not show. I'll give a good example. Horror films. Usually in a horror film, what makes something scary is more or less the idea of the thing rather than seeing the thing itself. So a movie like Jaws, which is, scary movie back in the day, one of the cool things is that you don't actually get to see what the shark looks like in full, and you don't get to see certain things. So you're not shown everything, right? There's this element of it that's not being shown. And that is the case as well for other elements of horror. So there are instances where it is better actually to show rather than tell. But those are actually the minority in the situation. And I bring this up to say this, right? If there was no such thing as a subject or as objectivity in film, then you wouldn't actually be able to look at a principle like show don't tell and actually see the results of it. And what's interesting though is then if films then are not subjective, are they then objective? And that's the other part of this argument that I see all the time too, is that people will say that films are objective and that there's something in the film in and of itself that's objective and there's no subjectivity at all. And with that, I also disagree with. See, there are elements of a film that might be scary to you that are not scary to me, that might be funny to you that are not funny to me. Now, it does not mean that the execution of that said thing doesn't matter. Not at all. That's where your subjectivity comes in, is that there are biases that we all have that make films digested just a little bit different. For example, I have a bias towards superhero movies. I tend to enjoy spandex and tights on screen. That's just how I am. Those are some of my proclivities. Now, because I enjoy those things, usually when I'm watching a superhero movie, even if it's trash, I can still mildly enjoy it, even though the movie is terribly executed. So those are sort of where my biases lie. But despite those biases, that does not mean that there isn't any objectivity in the film to glean from. So what do I think then? If films are not subjective and they're not objective, what are they? See, they're like everything else in life. They're a mix of the two. Think about it. Almost everything you can think of, there's an element of that thing that is objective and an element of it that's subjective. For example, I see an apple on a tree. The apple is objective. The object is the apple. I see a red apple. Now, a colleague of mine can look at that same apple and not see the red. See, some people are colorblind, but does that mean that the apple is not there or that it doesn't exist? No, it's just that our perspectives are different and how we see the apple is different. But the reality is that the apple is still there and that both perspectives on the color of the apple tend to matter. And the reason why this is important, and actually the reason why it's kind of cool and why I actually like film criticism and why you actually go watch a movie and then check the reviews later, is because there's an interesting way in which we're built as people. Now, to best illustrate it, I'm going to talk about the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Now, why am I bringing this up? It's important. Just hold on, okay? So on that show, the idea is that you're doing multiple choice questions. You answer enough questions, you get to the end, you become a millionaire. That's the gist of the show. Now, on the show, you have 3 different lifelines that are on the show. And in those specific lifelines, there's one called 50-50, where they take away 2 of the 4 multiple choice questions, leave you with 2 left. There's a second one called Phone a Friend, which is you phone a friend to get help on answering the question. And the last of these questions is Ask the Audience. Now, what's interesting here is that the first question, the first lifeline of 50-50, the percentage at the end of the day was 50-50, meaning that 50% of the people who chose that lifeline got a 50-50 result in getting the proper answer, which is still a lot better than the 25% that you would get from the 4 questions. But what's interesting is when you hear about the other 2 choices. See, when someone decides to phone a friend, what's interesting is that both people are working together on the question, and it actually raises the efficacy of the questions being answered. So the average actually goes from 50% in this case, or actually 25%, because they're looking at all 4 multiple choice answers, all the way up to 66%, meaning that of the people who use this, 66% of the time, they're actually getting the answer correct. Now, the last one, which is Ask the Audience, is actually the highest of all of these answers in terms of the percentages in which people got the right answer. In fact, I think the amount in which people got the answers correctly was over 90% of the time. So 90% of the time that the audience was asked what the answer to a question was, whatever they voted for was correct over 90% of the time. What does this tell us? There's this interesting aspect of us as people that even though we all have different biases and different perspectives, when we bring those ideas and biases and perspectives together, we actually are able to come up with better insight than if it's just one person working on their own. Because remember, these are 4 multiple choice questions, and the chances of getting them correct are 25%. So once you add an entire studio audience into that mix, you go from 25% to over 90%. But this part here is actually even crazier. So there's an experiment that was done where they took a bunch of jelly beans, put them in a jar. And with those jelly beans in that jar, what was done is they asked a group of people to look at that jar and just guess how many jelly beans were in there. Now, what's interesting is obviously when this is happening, people are just going to make guesses that are outlandish, wrong, some that are a bit higher, some that are much, much lower. But ultimately, there's an average aggregate of what's inside of the actual jar. What's interesting here is that when multiple people working together are guessing, when they average out their totals, so the person who, guessed 10,000 and the person who guessed 2,000, when everything is averaged out, it comes up to about 99% accuracy when it comes to the total number that was in the jar itself. So if there's 4,956 jelly beans, the average means that the average guess would be 4,592 as an example, right? I probably got my numbers wrong here, but you get the gist here. The idea is that when multiple people are looking at an objective thing, the subjectivity gets canceled out, and what you get is something that approximates very close to an objective answer. And that objective answer is what you get with your film. So your film is the exact same way. It's a collection of these filmmaking principles that are used in various different ways, hundreds if not thousands of them. And when all amalgamated together, they produce this objective thing called a film. or an object called a film. And when multiple people are viewing that film subjectively, everyone has their own biases, their own opinions, whatever that might be. But from everyone coming together and critiquing that film, what you then ultimately get is a more accurate object, a more accurate sighting of what that film is. And it's who knows how close we actually get in terms of that number. But in both the Millionaire situation and in the jar situation, the percentages are over 90% when you're looking at multiple people working together. So again, this idea that films are objective to me is false, because if that were in fact the case, what ends up happening here is, for lack of a better term here, reality breaks down. Because ultimately, everything that we have in life has this element of an object and then the subject looking at it. Everything's a mix of objectivity and subjectivity together. So ultimately, when you have movies and when you have film, there is something that's there that's being observed that is objective, yes, but we can only truly observe it through the subjectivity of others. And that's the beautiful thing about film. See, that's why you watch a movie and then you go watch reviews. That's why you watch a movie and then you go discuss it with other people. See, because you want to get closer to that true objective view of the film, because on your own, you can't get at it alone. I'm your man Lex. This is another theory video. And if you want to be on this ride with me and check out some movies and work together towards actually piecing out how good these movies actually are, piecing out the different insights that we can all get from the movies, feel free to hit that like button, subscribe, and be on the lookout for the next video, for the next review. Again, I'm your man Lex. Thank you so much for making it this far into the video. There's no such thing as entertainment, and I'm out. Peace.